Hey. So here we are, Friday, November 4th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and we are reading John Steinbeck, To a God Unknown. Let's see if I can get through. Oh, it's going to make noise. Let's listen to that. See if I can get through the next two chapters without bawling my eyeballs out and crying off my fresh eyelashes. Chapter 5. The grass was summer brown, ready for cutting, when the brothers came with their families and settled on the land. Thomas was the oldest, 42, a thick, strong man with golden hair and a long yellow mustache. His cheeks were round and red, and his eyes a cold, wintry blue between slitted lids. Thomas had a strong kinship with all kinds of animals. Often he sat on the edge of a manger while the horses ate their hay. The low moaning of a cow in labor could draw Thomas out of bed at any hour of the night to see that the calving was true, and to help if there were trouble. When Thomas walked through the fields, horses and cows raised their heads from the grass and sniffed the air and moved in toward him. He pulled dogs' ears until they cried with the pain his strong, slender fingers induced, and when he stopped, they put their ears up to be pulled again. Thomas always had a collection of half-wild animals. Before he had been a month on the new land, he had collected a raccoon, 2 half-grown coyote pups that slunk at his heels and snarled at everyone else, a box of ferrets, and a red-tailed hawk, besides 4 mongrel dogs. He was not kind to animals, at least no kinder than they were to each other, but he must have acted with a consistency beasts could understand, for all creatures trusted him. When one of the dogs foolishly attacked the coon and lost an eye in the encounter, Thomas was unruffled. He scraped out the torn eyeball with his pocket knife and pinched the dog's feet to make it forget the torture in its head. Thomas liked animals and understood them, and he killed them with no more feeling than they had about killing each other. He was too much of an animal himself to be sentimental. Thomas never lost a cow, for he seemed to know instinctively where a straying beef would stray. He rarely hunted, but when he did go out for game, he marched straight to the hiding place of his prey and killed it with the speed and precision of a lion. Thomas understood animals, but humans he neither understood nor trusted very much. He had little to say to men. He was puzzled and frightened by such things as trade and parties, religious forms and politics. When it was necessary to be present at a gathering of people, he effaced himself, said nothing, and waited with anxiety for release. Joseph was the only person with whom Thomas felt any relationship. He could talk to Joseph without fear. Thomas's wife was Rama, a strong, full-breasted woman with black brows that nearly met over her nose. She was nearly always contemptuous of everything men thought or did. She was a good and efficient midwife and an utter terror to evil-doing children. Although she never whipped her 3 little daughters, they went in fear of her displeasure, for she could find a soft spot in the soul and punish there. She understood Thomas, treated him as though he were an animal, kept him clean and fed and warm, and didn't often frighten him. Rama had ways of making her field: cooking, sewing, the bearing of children, house cleaning, seemed the most important things in the world, much more important than the things men did. The children adored Rama when they had been good, for she knew how to stroke the tender places in the soul. Her praise could be as delicate and sharp as her punishment was terrible. She automatically took charge of all children who came near her. Burton's 2 children recognized her authority as far more legally constituted than the changeable rules of their own soft mother maid. For the laws of Rama never changed. Bad was bad, and bad was punished, and good was eternally, delightfully good. It was delicious to be good in Rama's house. Burton was the one whom nature had constituted for religious life. He kept himself from evil. He found evil in nearly all close human contacts. Once, after a service to the church, he had been praised from the pulpit. "A strong man in the Lord," the pastor called him, and Thomas bent close to Joseph's ear and whispered, "A weak man in the stomach." Burton had embraced his wife 4 times. He had 2 children. Celibacy was a natural state for him. Burton was never well. His cheeks were drawn and lean, and his eyes hungry for a pleasure he did not expect this side of heaven. In a way, it gratified him that his health was bad, for it proved that God thought of him enough to make him suffer. Burton had the powerful resistance of the chronically ill. His lean arms and legs were strong as braided ropes. Burton ruled his wife with a firm and scriptural hand. He parceled out his thoughts to her and pared down her emotions when they got out of line. He knew when she exceeded the laws, and when, as happened now and then, some weak thing in Harriet cracked and left her sick and delirious. Burton prayed beside her bed until her mouth grew firm again and stopped its babbling. Benjamin, the youngest of the four, was a charge upon his brothers. He was dissolute and undependable. Given a chance, he drank himself into a romanticized haze and walked about the country singing gloriously. He looked so young, so helpless, and so lost that many women pitied him, and for this reason Benjamin was nearly always in trouble with some woman or another. For when he was drunk and singing, and the lost look was in his eyes, women wanted to hold him against their breasts and protect him from his blunders. It always surprised those who mothered Benjamin when he seduced them. They never quite knew how it happened, for this was a deadly helplessness. He accomplished things so badly that everyone tried to help him. His new young wife, Jenny, labored to keep Benjamin from hurt, and when she heard him singing in the night and knew that he was drunk again, she prayed he might not fall and hurt himself. The singing drew off into the dark, and Jenny knew that before the night was out, some perplexed and startled girl would lie with him. She cried a little for fear he might be hurt. Benji was a happy man, and he brought happiness and pain to everyone who knew him. He lied, stole a little, cheated, broke his word, and imposed upon kindnesses, and everyone loved Benji and excused and guarded him. When the families moved west, they brought Benji with them for fear he might starve if he were left behind. Thomas and Joseph saw that his homestead was in good order. He borrowed Joseph's tent and lived in it until his brothers found time to build him a house. Even Burton, who cursed Benji, prayed with him, and hated his way of living, couldn't let him live in a tent. Where he got whiskey, his brothers could never tell, but he had it always. In the Valley of Our Lady, the Mexicans gave him liquor and taught him their songs, and Benji took their wives when they were not watching him. Chapter 6. The families clustered about the house Joseph had built. They put up little shacks on their own land as the law required, but never for a minute did they think of the land as being divided into four. It was one ranch, and when the technicalities of the homesteading were satisfied, it was the Wayne Ranch. 4 square houses clustered near to the great oak, and the big barn belonged to the tribe. Perhaps because he had received the blessing, Joseph was the unquestioned lord of the clan. On the old farm in Vermont, his father had merged with the land until he became the living symbol of the unit, land and its inhabitants. The authority passed to Joseph. He spoke with the sanction of the grass, the soil, the beasts, wild and domesticated. He was the father of the farm. As he watched the community of cabins spring up on the land, as he looked down into the cradle of the firstborn, Thomas's new child, as he notched the ears of the first young calves, he felt the joy that Abraham must have felt when the huge promise bore fruit, when his tribesmen and his goats began to increase. Joseph's passion for fertility grew strong. He watched the heavy, ceaseless lust of his bulls and the patient, untiring fertility of his cows. He guided the great stallions to the mares, crying, "There, boy, drive in!" This place was not 4 homesteads. It was one, and he was the father. When he walked bareheaded through the fields, feeling the wind in his beard, his eyes smoldered with lust. All things about him, the soil, the cattle, and the people were fertile, and Joseph was the source, the root of their fertility. His was the motivating lust. He willed that all things about him must grow quickly, conceive, and multiply. The hopeless sin was barrenness, a sin intolerable and unforgivable. Joseph's blue eyes were growing fierce with his new faith. He cut off barren creatures mercilessly, but when a bitch crept about swollen with puppies, when a cow was fat with calf, that creature was holy to him. Joseph did not think these things in his mind, but in his chest and in the corded muscles of his legs. It was the heritage of a race which for 1,000,000 years had sucked at the breasts of the soil and cohabitated with the earth. One day Joseph stood by the pasture fence watching a bull with a cow. He beat his hands against the fence rail. A red light burned in his eyes. As Burton approached him from behind, Joseph whipped off his hat and flung it down and tore open the collar of his shirt. He shouted, "Mount, you fool! She's ready! Mount now!" "Are you crazy, Joseph?" Burton asked sternly. Joseph swung around. "Crazy? What do you mean?" "You're acting queerly, Joseph. Someone might see you here." Burton looked about to see if it was true. "I want calves," Joseph said sullenly. "Where's the harm in that, even to you?" "Well, Joseph," Burton's tone was firm and kind as he implanted his lesson, "everyone knows such things are natural. Everyone knows such things must happen if the race is to go on, but people don't watch unless it's necessary. You might be seen acting this way." Joseph reluctantly tore his eyes from the bull and faced his brother. "What if they did?" he demanded. "Is it a crime I want calves?" Burton looked down in shame for the thing he had to say. "People might say things if they heard you talking as I just did." "And what could they say?" "Surely, Joseph, you don't want me to say it. The scripture mentions such forbidden things. People might think your interest was personal." He looked at his hands and then hid them quickly in his pockets, as though to keep them from hearing what he said. "Ah," Joseph puzzled. "They might say, I see." His voice turned brutal. "They might say I felt like the bull. Well, I do, Burton. And if I could mount a cow and fertilize it, do you think I'd hesitate? Look, Burton, that bull can hit 20 cows a day. If feeling could put a cow with a calf, I would mount 100. That's how I feel, Burton." Then Joseph saw the gray, sick horror that had come over his brother's face. "You don't understand it, Burton," he said gently. "I want increase. I want the land to swarm with life. Everywhere. I want things to grow up." Burton turned sulkily away. "Listen to me, Burton. I think I need a wife. Everything on the land is reproducing. I'm the only sterile thing. I need a wife." Burton had started to move away, but he turned around and spat his words. "You need prayer more than anything. Come to me when you can pray." Joseph watched his brother walk away, and he shook his head in bewilderment. "I wonder what he knows that I don't know," he said to himself. "He has a secret in him that makes everything I think or do unclean. I have heard the telling of the secret, and it means nothing to me." He ran his fingers through his long hair, picked up his soiled black hat, and put it on. The bull came near the fence, lowered its head, and snorted. Then Joseph smiled and whistled shrilly, and at the whistle Juanito's head popped out of the barn. "Saddle a horse," Joseph cried. "There's more in this old boy. Drive in another cow." He worked mightily as the hills work to produce an oak tree, slowly and effortlessly, and with no doubt that it is at once the punishment and the heritage of the hills to strive thus. Before the morning light came over the range, Joseph's lantern flashed across the yard and disappeared into the barn. There among the warm and sleepy beasts he worked, mending harness, soaping the leather, cleaning the buckles. His curry comb rasped over muscled flanks. Sometimes he found Thomas there, sitting on a manger in the dark, with the coyote pups sleeping in the hay behind him. The brothers nodded good morning. "Everything all right?" Joseph asked. And Thomas, "Pigeon has cast a shoe and cracked his hoof. You shouldn't go out today. Granny the black devil kicked hell out of her stall. She'll hurt somebody some day if she doesn't kill herself first. Blue dropped a colt this morning, and that's what I came out to see." "How did you know, Tom? What made you know it would come this morning?" Thomas grabbed a horse's forelock and pulled himself down from the manger. "I don't know. I can always tell when a colt will drop. Come and see the little son of a bitch. Blue won't mind now. She's got him clean by now." They went to the box stall and looked over at the spider-legged colt, with knobby knees and a whisk broom for a tail. Joseph put out his hand and stroked the damp, shining coat. "By God," he cried, "I wonder why I love the little thing so much." The colt lifted its head and looked up sightlessly out of clouded, dark blue eyes, and then moved away from Joseph's hand. "You always want to touch them," Thomas complained. "They don't like to be touched when they're little like that." Joseph withdrew his hand. "I guess I'd better go to breakfast." "Oh, say," Thomas cried, "I saw some swallows fooling around. There'll be mud nests in the barn eaves and under the windmill tank next spring." The brothers had been working well together, all except Benji, and Benji shirked when he could. Under Joseph's orders, a long truck garden stretched out behind the house. A windmill stood on its high stilts and flashed its blades every afternoon when the wind came up. A long, unwalled cowshed arose behind the big stable. The barbed wire fences were edging out to to encircle the land. Wild hay grew rankly on the flats and on the side hills, and the stock was multiplying. As Joseph turned to leave the barn, the sun came over the mountains and sent warm white streaks through the square windows. Joseph moved into a shaft of light and spread his arms for a moment. A red rooster on the top of the manure pile outside the window looked in at Joseph, then squawked and retreated, flapping, and raucously warned the hens that something terrible would probably happen on so fine a day. Joseph dropped his arms and turned back to Thomas. "Get up a couple of horses, Tom. Let's ride out today and see if there are any new calves. Tell Juanito if you see him." After their breakfast, the three men rode away from their houses. Joseph and Thomas went side by side, and Juanito brought up the rear. Juanito had ridden home from Nuestra Senora in the dawn after spending a discreet and polite evening in the kitchen of the Garcia home. Alice Garcia had sat across from him, placidly watching, the crossed hands in her lap, and the elder Garcias, guardians and referees, were placed on either side of Juanito. "You see, I am not the only majordomo for Senor Wayne," Juanito explained into their admiring but slightly skeptical ears. "I am more like a son to Don Joseph. Where he goes, I go. He trusts only me with very important matters." Thus, for a couple of hours, he boasted mildly, and when, as decorum suggested, Alice and her mother retired, Juanito made formal words and prescribed gestures, and was finally accepted by Jesus Garcia, with a comely reluctance, as son-in-law. Then Juanito rode back to the ranch, quite tired and very proud, for the Garcias could prove at last one true Spanish ancestor, and now he rode behind Joseph and Thomas, rehearsing to himself the manner of his announcement. The sun blazed on the land as they rode up a grassy swell, looking for calves to notch and cut. The dry grass made a whisking noise under the horses' hooves. Thomas's horse skittered nervously, for in front of Thomas, perched on the saddle horn, rode a villainous raccoon with beady, evil eyes looking out of a black mask. It kept its balance by grasping the horse's mane with one little black hand. Thomas looked ahead with eyes drooped against the sun. "You know," he said, "I was in Nuestra Senora Saturday." "Yes," Joseph said impatiently. "Benji must have been there too. I heard him singing late at night. Tom, that old boy will be getting into trouble. Some things the people here will not stand. Some day we'll find Benji with a knife in his neck. I tell you, Tom, he'll get a knife some day." Thomas chuckled. "Let him, Joe. He'll have had more fun than a dozen sober men, and he'll have lived longer than Methuselah." "Well, Burton worries about it all the time. He's spoken to me about it over and over." "I was telling you," said Thomas. "I sat in the store in Nuestra Senora Saturday afternoon, and the riders from Chinito were there. They got to talking about the dry years from 80 and 90. Did you know about them?" Joseph tied a new knot in the riata string in his saddle. "Yes," he said softly, "I've heard about them. Something was wrong. They won't ever come again." "Well, the riders were talking about it. They said the whole country dried up and the cattle died and the land turned to powder. They said they tried to move the cows to the interior, but most of them died on the way. The rain came a few years before they got here. The rain came a few years before you got here." He pulled the coon's ears until the fierce little creature slashed at his hands with his sharp teeth. Joseph's eyes were troubled. He brushed his beard down with his hand and turned the ends under, as his father had done. "I heard about it, Tom, but it's all over now. Something was wrong, I tell you. It won't come again ever. The hills are full of water." "How do you know it won't come again? The writers said it had been before. How can you say it won't ever come again?" Joseph set his mouth determinedly. "It can't come. The hill springs are all running. I can't see how it will come again." Juanito urged his horse abreast of them. "Don Joseph, I hear a cowbell over the rise." The three men swung the horses to the right and put them to a canter. The coon leapt into Thomas's shoulder and clung to his neck with its strong little arms. Over the rise they galloped. They came upon a little herd of red cows, and two young calves tottered among the cows. In a moment the calves were down. Juanito took a bottle of liniment from his pocket, and Thomas opened the broad-blade knife. The shining knife snickered out the Wayne brand in the ear of both calves, while they bawled hopelessly, and their mother stood by, bellowing with apprehension. Then Thomas knelt beside the bull calf. With 2 cuts he performed the castration and sloshed liniment on the wound. The cows snorted with fear when they smelled the blood. Juanito untied the feet of the new steer, and the new steer scrambled up and hobbled lamely off to its mother. The men mounted and rode on. Joseph had picked up the pieces of ear. He looked at the little brown fragments for a moment and then thrust them into his pocket. Thomas watched the act. "Joseph," he said suddenly, "why do you hang the hawks you kill in the oak tree beside your house?" "To warn off other hawks from the chickens, of course. Everybody does that." But you know goddamn well it doesn't work, Joe. No hawk in the world will let the chance of a pullet go by just because his dead cousin is hanging up by the foot. Why, he'll eat his cousin if he can. He paused for a moment, then continued quietly. You nail the ear notchings to the tree, too, Joseph. His brother turned angrily in his saddle. I nail up the notchings so I'll know how many calves there are. Thomas looked puzzled. He lifted the coon to his shoulder again, where it sat carefully, and licked the inside of his ear. I almost know what you're doing, Joe. Sometimes it almost comes to me what you're getting at. It's about the dry ears. Is it about the dry ears, Joseph? Are you working already against them? If it isn't for the reason I told you, it's none of your damn business, is it? Joseph said doggedly. His eyes were worried, and his voice grew soft with perplexity. Besides, I don't understand it myself. If I tell you about it, you won't tell Burton, will you? Burton worries about all of us. Thomas laughed. Nobody tells Burton anything. He has always known everything. Well, Joseph said, I'll tell you about it. Our Father gave me a blessing before I came out here, an old blessing, the kind it tells about in the Bible, I think. But in spite of that, I don't think Burton would have liked it. I've always had a curious feeling about Father. He was so completely calm. He wasn't much like other fathers, but he was a kind of last resort, a thing you could tie to that would never change. Did you feel like that? Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, I know. Well, then I came out here, and I still felt safe. Then I got a letter from Burton, and for a second I was thrown out of the world, falling, with nothing to land on ever. Then I read on, where Father said he was coming out to see me after he was dead. The house wasn't built then. I was sitting on a pile of lumber. I looked up, and I saw that tree. Joseph fell silent and stared down at the horse's mane. After a moment, he looked over at his brother, but Thomas avoided his eyes. Well, that's all. Maybe you can figure it out. I just do the things I do. I don't know why, except that it makes me feel happy to do them. After all, he said lamely, a man has to have something to tie to, something he can trust to be there in the morning. Thomas caressed the coon with more gentleness than he usually bestowed on his animals, but still he did not look at Joseph. He said, You remember once when I was a kid, I broke my arm? I had it in a splint doubled up in my chest and it hurt like hell. Father came up to me and opened my hand, and he kissed the palm. That was all he did. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect of Father, but it was all right because it was more like medicine than a kiss. I felt it run up my broken arm like cool water. It's funny how I remember that so well. Far ahead of them, a cowbell clanged. Juanito trotted up. In the pines, senor. I don't know why they'd be in the pines where there's no feed. They turned their horses up the ridge, which was crowned with the dark pines. The first trees stood deployed like outposts. Their trunks were as straight as masts, and the bark was purple in the shade. The ground under them, deep and spongy with brown needles, supported no grass. The grove was quiet except for a whispering of wind. Birds took no pleasure in the pines, and the brown carpet muffled the sound of walking creatures. The horsemen rode in among the trees, out of the yellow sunlight and into the purple gloom of the shade. As they went, the trees grew closer together, leaned for support, and joined their tops to make one complete unbroken ceiling of needles. Among the trunks, the undergrowth sprang up brambles and blackberries, and the pale, light-hungry leaves of guatras. The tangle grew thicker at every step, until at last the horses stopped and refused to force their way farther into the thorn-armed barrier. Then Juanito turned his horse sharply to the left. This way, senors. I remember the path this way. He led them to an old track, deep buried in needles but free of growth, and wide enough for two to ride together. For 100 yards they followed the path, and then suddenly Joseph and Thomas drew up and started at the first thing in front of them. And stared at the thing in front of them. They had come to an open glade, nearly circular and as flat as a pool. The dark trees grew about it, straight as pillars, and jealously close together. In the center of the clearing stood a rock as big as a house, mysterious and huge. It seemed to be shaped cunningly and wisely, and yet there was no shape in the memory to match it. A short, heavy green moss covered the rock with soft pile. The edifice was something like an altar that had melted and run down over itself. In one side of the rock there was a small black cave, fringed with five-fingered ferns, and from the cave a little stream flowed silently and crossed the glade and disappeared into the tangled brush that edged the clearing. Beside the stream a great black bull was lying, his front legs folded under him, a hornless bull with shining black ringlets on his forehead. When the three men entered the glade, the bull had been chewing his cud and staring at the green rock. He turned his head and looked at the men with red-rimmed eyes. He snorted, scrambled to his feet, lowered his head at them, and then, turning, plunged into the undergrowth and broke a passage free. The men saw the lashing tail for a moment, and the long, black, swinging scrotum, which hung nearly to the knees, and then he disappeared, and they heard him crashing in the brush. It all happened in a moment. Thomas cried, "That's not our bull. I never saw it before." And then he looked uneasily at Joseph. "I never saw this place before. I don't think I like it. I can't tell." His voice was babbling, and his voice was babbling. He held the coon tightly under his arm, while it struggled and bit and tried to escape. Joseph's eyes were wide, looking at the glade as a whole. He saw no single thing in it. His chin was thrust out. He filled his chest to a painful tightness and strained the muscles of his arms and shoulders. He had dropped the bridle and crossed his hands on the saddle horn. "Be still a moment, Tom," he said languidly. "There's something here. You are afraid of it, but I know it. Somewhere, perhaps, in an old dream, I have seen this place, or perhaps felt the feeling of this place." He dropped his hands to his sides and whispered, trying the words, "This is holy, and this is old. This is ancient and holy." The glade was silent. A buzzard swept across the circular sky, low over the treetops. Joseph turned slowly. "Juanito, you knew this place. You have been here." The light blue eyes of Juanito were wet with tears. "My mother brought me here, Señor. My mother was Indian. I was a little boy, and my mother was going to have a baby. She came here and sat beside the rock. For a long time she sat, and then we went away again. She was Indian, Señor. Sometimes I think the old ones come here still." "The old ones?" Joseph asked quickly. "What old ones?" "The old Indians, Señor. I'm sorry I brought you here, but when I was so close, the Indian in me made me come, Señor." Thomas cried nervously, "Let's get the hell out of here. We've got to find the cows." And Joseph obediently turned his horse. But as they rode out of the silent glade and down the path, he spoke soothingly to his brother. "Don't be afraid, Tom. There's something strong and sweet and good in there. There's something like food in there, and like cool water. We'll forget it now, Tom. Only maybe sometime, when we have need, we'll go back again and be fed." And the three men fell silent and listened for cowbells. The rocks that make the foundation of my home were quarried here. And there are many places here in California that are state parks that have old sites, historic sites. One such place is Old Poly State Park off of the 101, north of San Francisco. And it has both a ranchero, historic adobe ranchero settlement, as well as a Miwok settlement. And the rocks that they're talking about were used, and there were usually encroachments found by well springs or water sources and there were villages, and food staples were processed there, food staples like bay nuts and acorns. There are artifacts on the property here, and looking at the rocks in the foundation of the home, I believe that it was such an encroachment that was broken up by the man who built the home. There are marks in some of the stones. There are, it looks like tools to me, as a person who uses tools, and there are mortars and pestles and grindstones. And it's touching something. The site at Olampali was supposed to be at least it was over 1,500 years old, 2,000 years old, something like that. Touching such an artifact. Living with on a foundation of such artifact is humbling as a human being, as a user of tools. And that stillness, that sacredness. I have experienced that here on this property, among these trees, with these animals here, on more than one occasion. On more than one occasion. And it is holy. It most certainly is. And you don't have to be Indian to feel it. You just have to be human. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I'm crying and I don't want to lose my eyelashes.